Pokemon Pocket has seen some truly ridiculous cards, and what I want to do in today's video is take a look back at the A series specifically. I believe I've identified the 10 strongest cards, and we're not going based off of who has the highest HP or who does the most damage. No, I am taking a look at what cards were the most meta warping, had the most longevity, were able to be good utility cards across multiple decks. I also need to mention that we are not doing trainer cards on this list. This list is solely based on the Pokemon. I might do a top 10 or top 5 trainer list later on, but for now, we're just sticking to the Pokemon. If you're wondering what makes me qualified to make this list, I've been playing the game since the very beginning, making content on it, and since Ranked has come out, if I've enjoyed the meta, I've been in the top 1,000. So if you're looking for new, more competitive, ranked-based Pokemon Pocket content, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel and like the video, and let me know if you enjoy this style. I definitely have some other things I want to go through on the A series and make list for. So when I took a look at every single card that has been released, there were actually not really 10 cards that really impacted the meta for multiple months. You'll see as we get farther down the list that there are cards that have been relevant for almost the entirety of the A series. So at number 10, I want to give my flowers to something from Genetic Apex, the very first set of the game, and I'm going with Pikachu. There were two decks that were very strong, Pikachu and Mewtwo. They were kind of the staples of that format, but I think Pikachu was a bit stronger than Mewtwo. In Pokemon Pocket, we don't really have any tournaments, like in-person tournaments or events to prove what decks are the strongest. We only have online tournaments. And there used to be a tournament series called the Ursa Day, which was massive. These tournaments would have over 1,000 people competing in them. And during the Genetic Apex format, there were 8 of them. Of those 8, Pikachu won 5 of those tournaments. Mewtwo won 2, and a Charizard managed to take down just 1 of them. So Pikachu dominated these 1,000+ player tournaments more than any other deck by a wide margin. The card was just super consistent in a time when there wasn't really a lot of consistency in the game. Everything had the 2 research and the 2 Pokeball, but there wasn't really any other way to draw cards for you. So a basic Pokemon EX that could hit for 90 damage with just 2 energy was a monster to deal with. If you look at the meta matchups, the only bad matchup this card had was Mewtwo, and it was like a 46%. Everything else was positive. Even fighting decks had a hard time against Pikachu. If you went first against a Pikachu as a fighting type deck, they would have the energy advantage. They could start dishing out 90 damage with Pikachu as soon as their second turn, wiping you off the board. It was just a super scary deck to deal with, so I'm giving it the number 10 spot. It did not go on for that much longer. It was still relevant in Mythical Island. Once Spacetime Smackdown came out, the deck sort of fell off, and Pikachu would only see a very small resurgence when, like, Suicune would come out, and that was a tier 3 deck at best. So Pikachu really only had 2 sets to him, but during those 2 sets, he was very impactful. Now, this number 9 slot could have been a couple different cards, because I think that really there's like a top 8, and these 9th place and 10th place are sort of honorary mentions. And what this 9th place is occupying is, okay, well, maybe this wasn't, meta warping, but what was a card that was relevant in the meta, a top 5 deck for multiple seasons, and, again, was never truly on top, but was always something you had to consider in the meta? So the card I'm giving it to is Charizard from Shining Revelry with the Stoke attack, Stokezard. This was a card that when it came out didn't really do anything, but as soon as we saw Rare Candy, it became like the high roll deck to play. It was always in the top 5 of the meta after that, because if you just go Rare Candy Charizard early, use that Stoke attack, it powers itself up, and then you're swinging for 150 damage every single turn. You also had Lily in Celestial Guardians, so you could heal 60 damage from this guy. It has 180 HP, just making it even harder to knock out. In the very beginning, we saw it played with Incineroar. The deck was, very high rolly. And once we saw cards like Sylveon came out, the deck became a bit more consistent. Again, it was never the top deck in the format, never truly reached that height, but it was always a very good high roll deck to give a go. There were times where it was top 3 in the meta. That's probably as high as it could go. Just, you know, naturally being weak to, it was an EX based deck, so it would have trouble with some of those EX counter decks. And it's just not the most consistent thing, with not a lot of variations in the plays you can make, right? It's like Rare Candy Charizard, that's your play. That's your one play for the game. There isn't much to outskill your opponent, outmaneuver them. It just depends on, did you draw the right card? So Charizard's going to be number 9. Some other cards that could have been here are something like Guzzlord was relevant for a bit of time. Maybe something, I can't even think of any other ones, to be honest. There are not a lot of cards that were not, you know, meta defining and were good for that many sets. A lot of the EXs, if you go back and you look through, got power crept pretty quickly and became irrelevant after just 1 or 2 sets. So Charizard, congratulations, you made the list in some way. At number 8, I don't know if you consider this cheating, but to me, these 2 cards don't exist without the other. And those are going to be Magneton and Magnezone. Now, you could say, well, you can't play Charizard without Charmander, so why isn't Charmander on this list? The reason why Magnezone is good is because of Magneton's ability. And the reason why Magneton's ability is good is because of Magnezone. These cards have to be played together. So Magneton, its ability is going to let you charge a lightning energy onto it once per turn, and then the Magnezone just has a nice 110 damage attack for 1 lightning energy, 2 colorless. Very, very important. This meant that Magnezone would become a card that could be splashed into any type, because Magneton would get the lightning energy for you. Magnezone only requiring 1 lightning energy to attack meant that you could use Magneton's ability twice. The first turn you evolved it, the next turn before you evolved into Magnezone, and you would have guaranteed 2 attacks with the Magnezone if you were playing another energy type, if the Magnezone didn't get knocked out. So what you saw from Magnezone when it first came out was it was paired with some strong EXs. Darkrai played it. There was a Magnezone Skarmory deck that was all 1-point Pokemon. That was pretty good in that format as well. The card would sort of dip off in popularity from there, and then saw a real big resurgence when we got Oricorio, because now you have Oricorio to wall, and you have this big stage 2 attacker to set up. Now, Magneton is like so important to the deck, because even when Rare Candy came out, this deck never played Rare Candy. You never play Rare Candy with your Magnezones. The Magneton is just that strong. You really need that extra energy acceleration. It allows you to power up another Pokemon in play and know that, like, you're going to be able to attack with Magnezone despite the fact that you're not using your turn attachment to it. Just very, very strong. Now, Magnezone has, maybe during the beginning of Spacetime Smackdown, Magnezone Darkrai was the top deck. But other than that, Magnezone does not really hit the peaks. It's just always a sort of counter meta deck that is around and is very, very strong. Very impactful to the meta, but it never really hits the peaks that these other cards on the list have. So I'm going to leave Magnezone here at number 8. I think it is a fine spot for it. I promise this is the last 2-card inclusion, but I don't want to give these 2 separate cards a spot on the list, and I really think that both of them deserve to be talked about. So the first one is Sylveon EX. Sylveon EX was a ridiculous card. It was the first time we saw draw support as an ability on a Pokemon, and this really, really warped the meta. There were not a lot of good ways to get cards out of your deck, and Sylveon, with its ability, when you evolve it, draw 2 cards, it just made it a research. So now, if you're playing a Sylveon in your deck, you are playing for research. When this card came out, it was at the very top of the meta. It was the number 1 deck, deservedly so. And it also saw utility in other decks as well. Charizard would play Sylveon. Crobat would play Sylveon. Any of these more high roll stage 2 decks would put Sylveon in it, because it's just that powerful to have essentially 2 more research in your deck when you're just going for the rare candy combo. The next card I want to discuss is EVEX. So they came out in the same set, and EVEX had similar utility of this card unlocked all of the EV box decks that we saw. Espeon Sylveon wouldn't exist without EVEX. Flareon Jolteon, Flareon Leafeon. These decks existed because the EVEX's ability allows you to evolve it into a evolution. So now, instead of just playing 2 EV in your deck, you basically have 4 EVs in your deck, meaning you can set up 4 different evolutions. Your deck is way more consistent. You don't have to worry as much about, like, hoping that the Pokeball hits the right cards, because a lot of these decks just played the 4 EVs and then all of the evolutions. This deck, again, only possible because it was the only Pokemon line in the game that had access to 4 basics instead of 2. It's really, really strong, and I think it deserves to be talked about because it's cool that they even printed it. I think it was a nice, interesting design choice because, again, when do you the Flareon, Leafeon, and the Espeon Sylveon, like, they are very cool decks to be playing different evolutions that came from the same basic, and they give you more of those basics to play in your deck. Wouldn't exist without EVX. So I'm leaving them tied up here because, again, they both had their own utility, and I guess the main thing is that they were played in some decks together. So I think they're good to talk about both of them at the same time. At number 6, I'm going to have one of my favorite EXs, Arceus EX. Now, I was not a fan of this card when it first came out. The meta was pretty bad in Triumphant Light on Arceus's release, but Arceus is super strong. It is a basic Pokemon, 140 HP, and it can do 130 damage for just 3 energy. It also has an ability that really didn't need to be there, but was just sort of an additional buff, where it can't be affected by special conditions. It's also colorless, so it can go with any type. And this is what you saw from Arceus EX. When this card came out, it was so much stronger as an attacker than any other EX, or basic EX at least, that we had seen. This thing ruled the format. And it only lost its spot later on because it was kind of power crept out. But it lost its spot as the top deck, sure. But this deck continued to exist for the rest of A series. Because it's colorless, you saw it paired with Oricorio, Darkrai, Meowscarada. There were some fire variants. There was the Crobat variant, Arceus Carnivine. The list goes on and on. There were a lot of ways to play Arceus EX because of that splash ability. The fact that you can use any energy with it. Its peak was definitely with Arceus and Dialga. Dialga would just let you power up Arceus immediately. And this was before any sort of anti-EX cards. So the deck just played EX attackers, which is, again, why I didn't really love the format. It was just basics, and it was so much stronger than any other card and way more consistent. The meta for that was basically just Arceus and then Rampardos high roll, in hopes that if you got the Rampardos set up, you could probably just win that matchup. Not a fun time at all, but after that, Arceus became a pretty cool guy. When Arceus was more balanced, given that other cards were stronger, and you could play it in so many different ways, Arceus became very, very fun. Some of my favorite decks were the Arceus Carnivine, the Arceus Daycare, where you just played like 5 baby Pokemon, just trying to power up Arceus as fast as possible, and using Darkrai in red to boost Arceus's damage all the way up to 170. That was a great deck for ranked. It was very simple to pilot, and it's really fun to hit for 170 damage with a basic Pokemon for just 3 energies. I'm a big fan of Arceus. I would have it higher, but again, after that first meta where he was the strongest deck, it was always like a tier 2 deck, never really any higher than that. At number 5, I'm going to do Oricorio. Now, maybe you think this card should be higher, and there's an argument, honestly, for it to be higher. Oricorio has never really been the top dog in the meta. My ranking for Oricorio at 5 really comes from just the influence of the guy. Since Oricorio has come out, basically every deck respects it enough to play some sort of counter. And honestly, if some of these decks decided, all right, we're not playing, you know, these Pokemon that are non-EX attackers, Oricorio could be the top deck, right? Its ability is that strong. Its ability says it cannot be damaged by your opponent's EX Pokemon. And then it has a pretty weak attack for 50 damage, but it's enough when your opponent is doing nothing to it. The card, it's really the fact that it has influenced the meta so heavily that deck building had to change upon its release. That makes me have it up here at number 5. Oricorio, we've seen a lot of it played a lot of different ways. Greninja Oricorio, Magnezone Oricorio. It usually finds its way into many lightning decks because it's just that strong. And it also at some point saw an inclusion in like Suicune decks, not even as an attacker, but just to be a wall at some point. Throw up the Oricorio, hope that your opponent can't do anything about it, doesn't have a Cyrus play or a Sabrina play, and give you just one extra turn. This card is very, very strong. I don't really need to tell you how strong it is. I'm sure a lot of you are annoyed by it. I don't have a problem with it. I think it's good to not have just EX-based decks and to force you to have cards that can deal with it. There's also the fact that at the start of any given meta, Oricorio is usually super, super powerful. The new cards come out, people aren't paying too much attention to it, aren't respecting it in their deck building. So for the first like week of a meta, Oricorio can kind of run it. And we've seen it time and time again, where during that first week, some Oricorio slop variant is the #1 deck. And then as decks get figured out, it kind of just gradually falls off, usually cementing itself back into its rightful place in the Magnezone deck. That becomes the main way to play Oricorio. And that is always a meta threat. It's never the #1 deck in the meta, but it's always just strong enough that it is something you have to consider and you don't want to give up an auto loss to. As I talk about these cards, I realize how hard it is to mention one without mentioning another one on this list. All of the strongest cards in the game seem to get along pretty well together and end up impacting the meta as a group. So at number 4, I have Darkrai EX, one of the strongest abilities on an EX Pokemon. When you attach a Darkness energy to it, you do 20 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Darkrai plus passive damage, man, when it came out, was so strong. Darkrai really ruled the meta for a long time. Towards the end of that meta, people did discover, well, if I just play like Exeggutor EX and nothing else, it's kind of hard for Darkrai to beat me. I'm going to hit them for weakness. The 20 damage doesn't matter if I play Double Potion, Double Erica. But for a time, you saw Darkrai with Magnezone, Darkrai with Greninja, and you would sit behind like Druddigon, which if you attacked into, you would take 20 damage from. And Rocky Helmet came out, so you could get up to a passive 60 damage every single turn. If your opponent was swinging into the Druddigon, you put a Rocky Helmet on it, and you were attaching to Darkrai. It was super annoying. After that, Darkrai sort of fell off. It wasn't anything in like Triumphant Light. It really got its, its value back when Giratina came out, and that became the dominant deck for the rest of the format, for the rest of the A series, right? So Darkrai, I value just a little bit less than some of its other partners. While it is very, very strong and played a crucial role, I think that, the other card is just a bit stronger than it. So Darkrai is going to be reserved to the number 4 slot. Did dominate the first meta when it was. It didn't need the other guy in order to do that. It was able to hold it down on its own. Even though this is just about the A series, Darkrai is probably a card that we will see for a while longer, just because, again, that ability is so, so strong. Really, the only weak point of this card is that it has a 2 retreat cost. And nowadays, you really don't want to be playing Leaf in your deck. It's kind of a waste. Anything with 2 retreat costs is just sort of sad. And so Darkrai usually ends up being like a one of, because you just don't want to start him. And you kind of can't afford to start him because it'll slow you down so much, or you have to play Leafy in your deck, which just objectively makes your deck worse than if you could go without it. So Darkrai is going to be here at number 4. At number 3, I have Suicune EX. Where to begin with this card? The ability. At the end of your turn, draw 1 card. Its attack, 20 damage for every bench Pokemon in play, meaning for just 2 energy, you can hit for 120 damage. This card enabled the most consistent deck maybe ever, because you are just getting +1 card every single turn. It was paired with Greninja in order to boost its damage and unlock Cyrus plays. This card, when it came out, just forced Sylveon out, right? It's a basic Pokemon. You don't need to run 4 cards in your deck to get that extra draw. You just need a basic, and you can start that draw earlier than Sylveon. So Sylveon, like, did not become, or was not a thing when this card came out. It completely replaced it in the Greninja deck. And now it's like, it's tough because this card might just be the strongest EX of Series A, but it doesn't have the longevity, and it does rely on some of these other cards that I think I gotta respect the other cards a bit more that might have the longevity and were partners alongside Suicune, because they were doing it for longer and they were still able to keep up when Suicune came out. But when Suicune came out, that format, man, it was a total shift. You were now, if you weren't playing Suicune, you were not allowed to play the same game anymore. The best Suicune counter decks were things that were playing as little Pokemon as possible. So like Guzzlord. Guzzlord played 3 Pokemon. 2 Guzzlord and a Celesteela to switch them out. You had to just play a less fun version of Pokemon in order to compete with Suicune in the Secluded Springs meta. It was very, very annoying. Nothing else had access to that level of draw, or if they did, like, they released the other legendary beast and they made Entei, who has a, you know, a decent attack, but it's weak to Suicune, so forget about that idea. And then Raikou, who should, you know, you would think would have a good time into Suicune, but it really just didn't. Its attack only did 60 damage plus 10 to the bench, and it had 130 HP instead of 140 HP like the other 2. So they really wanted this set to be, yo, Suicune's gonna dominate. Anything that could potentially stand in its way, like, we're not gonna give a chance to. Suicune ran that meta. It was definitely like one of the most polarizing metas ever, and to me, one of the least fun metas, because again, in order to compete with Suicune reliably, you had to subject yourself to playing a less fun version of the game. Playing Guzzlord 18, playing any like 18, essentially 18 trainer deck is not fun to me. We even saw Charizard start to come back at the very end of the meta, and it would just play the 2 Charmanders, the Charizards, and then a Cleffa to try to search for some more Pokemon. But in my opinion, that deck wasn't even good into Suicune either. If Suicune got an attack off early and you weren't able to find your Charizard, then the game was kind of over from there. All Suicune needed was 2 back-to-back attacks, and that would usually be enough to deal with Charizard. It could also play Hand Disruption because it's drawing so many cards. It's going to see the Hand Disruption often. They're going to see their... Oh, how could I forget? It also has access to Irida, right? Heal 40 damage from each of your Water-type Pokemon. There was so much support for this card by the end of the A block that the deck had everything, man. There was nothing it was missing. Had some of the best healing support ever. Had Greninja, it had Giratina, it had draw support built into it. Absolutely insane deck, but I'm leaving it at number 3, and hopefully you hear out my argument for why it is only at number 3. At number 2, I have what I think is the most impactful EX for as long as it was released, and that's going to be Giratina EX. This card says, once during your turn, you may attach a psychic energy from your energy zone to it. If you do, your turn ends. Has 150 HP and does 130 damage for 3 psychic energy and 1 colorless. Also does 20 damage to itself if it attacks. As soon as this card came out, it was immediately, you throw it together with Darkrai, and it is the strongest deck in the format for a very, very long time. Few reasons for this. Giratina Darkrai only needed to play 4 Pokemon, meaning you had 16 deck slots available to you to be used for very, very strong trainer cards. So you had access to Heal, Hand Disruption, Sabrina and Cyrus, damage modifiers, like everything you could want in the deck was there. It was also so consistent, just needing 2 basics to get going. It's not even like Arceus where you have to fill your bench with basics to make it do its maximum amount of damage. No, you just needed a Darkrai and a Giratina, and you could kind of run the game from there. It put your opponent on a very short timer, because after 3 turns, you'd have a powered-up Giratina and a powered-up Darkrai. Giratina charging itself up, Darkrai charging itself up, doing passive damage with it. Just an absolute monster. We all know Darktina was super impactful for forever. And even in Secluded Springs, the one time it wasn't the most popular deck, the strongest deck, it stayed relevant because it beat Suicune. So it was always either the strongest deck in the format or had a good matchup into the strongest deck. Now, why do I put more respect on Giratina than the other EXs? Well, not only did Giratina fill a role in its own deck, but it was used in a lot of other decks too. If your deck needed a end game attacker doing a lot of damage, Giratina was that option for you. We saw Giratina in decks that didn't even play Psychic Energy because it would just charge itself up. Same with Darktina that played Dark Energy. But these other decks as well, you would just slot in a Giratina as your, your end game attacker. We saw Greninja Tapu Lele played it. Suicune played it. Suicune relied very... the Giratina was a very important part of the Suicune deck, because if your opponent wasn't playing down their bench, or maybe, towards the end of the game, that's just how it naturally goes. They have much less of a bench, so your Suicune's doing less damage. Well, you can kind of force them, like, hey, you got to start getting set up because my Suicune might not be doing as much damage, but here's a Giratina back here that's ready to do 130 damage. So just be prepared for that at some point. The card was absolutely insane, thrown into a lot of different decks, and filled that role very well of being an end game attacker. Yeah, it's just the most impactful EX card, I think, out of the entire A series. Our number 1 card fits all of my criteria better than anything else. It has the longevity. It has the strength. It has the splash ability. Very fitting. We're listening to the Cyrus Boss theme right now. But it's got to be Greninja. Greninja released in Genetic Apex, and since then has been in the meta for basically every single set. There's only one set I can think of where Greninja was not, at least a top 10 deck, and that was during like Triumphant Light, where there was just there just wasn't a role for it. But Greninja, Genetic Apex, was played with Articuno. Mythical Island was played with Gyarados. Spacetime Smackdown played with Darkrai. Then finally, I don't think Darkrai Greninja was the top deck for that format, but you would eventually start to see it become one of the best decks with Rare Candy when that came out. This card has benefited from so many buffs across the A series because its ability is just that strong. You do 20 damage anywhere you want every single turn, once per turn. So it is a built-in red. It is a built-in Cyrus enabler. You just ping the bench and then use Cyrus, bring up a 2-point Pokemon for game. And again, it has that utility. Not only does it have that utility, but you have to realize this card is so strong that take something like Giratina. All right, if my deck needs a role fulfilled by Giratina, I'm giving up 1 card. If you want to play Greninja in your deck, you are giving up 6 card slots. This card is so powerful that you are willing to cut out 25% of your deck in order to get that extra 20 damage every single turn. It is that strong. This thing has warped the meta, or impacted the meta at least, the entire time it's been out. And again, there's been so many variants of it. There's no card that has been played with as many other Pokemon as Greninja. Has always been something to fear in the meta. I do miss the days when Greninja was cool. He definitely, again, he has benefited from every single consistency buff that has come out. Greninja was a card that used to be held back by the fact that it was a stage 2 that you had to manually evolve through. Rare Candy comes out, now you can Rare Candy it out. And then once draw cards came out like Sylveon and Suicune, it really let Greninja run away with the format, becoming the most ridiculous card ever. Because now it is not a question of if you're going to get Rare Candy Greninja, it's just when. Sylveon was the top deck with Greninja. Suicune was the top deck with Greninja. Tapu Lele Greninja, Snorlax Greninja were both very strong contenders in the Celestial Guardians format. And nowadays, while we're only talking about A-Series, you know, you also got to give it to Greninja because this is probably going to be the card that lasts the longest. Now that we have double copycat, you are seeing Greninja in decks that you would never think. It's just the Greninja package is absolutely everywhere. Because we just keep getting more consistency, and more consistency means Greninja is easier to set up, so he's going to be put into more decks. Yeah, I don't know if you can make an argument for any card stronger than Greninja. It is absolutely the card that defined the A-Series, I think. If you look at all the way through, since Genetic Apex, and it is kind of cool that the way it worked out, where Greninja came out at the very beginning of the game, and as the game progressively got more consistent, Greninja benefited from all of those buffs. So if you started the game and all you pulled was 2 Greninja, hey, you you got the best card ever, and you could do something with it every single set. You could just keep updating your Greninja deck on every set release and still have a top tier contender. Guys, that's going to be it for the video. Let me know what you think. Let me know what I should rank next. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and I will see you on the next one.